Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Air Force One Pavilion at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. My name is Tony Pennay, and I'm the director of the Annenberg Presidential Learning Center. And it's tradition that we begin each program that we do here at the library with the Pledge of Allegiance. So I ask that you now please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Before we begin our event tonight, I wanted to take just a moment to recognize a few of our special guests. First of all, I'd like to welcome students, coaches, teachers, and parents from the Los Angeles Metropolitan Debate League. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'd also like to welcome the students and staff who are in attendance from Royal High School here in Simi. This year we've embarked on a partnership with them for a Citizen Scholar Institute. We're excited to have them out as well. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Cherian Koshi from the National Forensic League. Thanks for flying out from Minnesota to join us here for this event tonight. I'd also like to take just a moment to publicly recognize and thank the sponsors of this program, whose financial generosity and support has made this entire debate series possible. So thank you, first of all, to Robert and Denise Zelstra for your support of this program and civic education in general. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Mr. Steve Maloof, who's here on behalf of the Chapman-Hansen Foundation, and their support of our continued education efforts over the past several years. So thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to thank Mr. Rick Duffy, who's here with the National Student Leadership Conference. They've supported this program, and they've done a lot of great work to develop student leaders. So thank you for coming as well. And I also just wanted to take a quick moment to thank the rest of you who decided to show up, that the best way to spend a Saturday evening was to watch a couple of amazing high school students debate a balanced budget. So thank you for donating and investing your Saturday night. So thank you all for coming tonight. Now, I also want to provide just a little bit of context for this event to our audience, and I thought that the best way to do that was to share a story that President Reagan liked to tell to school audiences from time to time. You see, it was the end of October, and typically the end of October brings the first series of report cards. And there was a young man, an elementary school student, who got his first report card, and he had to take it home and get signed by his dad. He wasn't really looking forward to this task because his report card was offensive. He had all failing grades, and his behavior and his effort were terrible as well. So his dad really let him have it. And the next day he returned to school, kind of tail between his legs, with the signed report card, and he handed it to his teacher. And he said, "You know, my dad told me that the next time I bring home a report card that looks like this one, somebody's going to be in big trouble. So if I were you, I'd watch out." Well, it's time for America to watch out, because when it comes to civic education, our report card is not very good. According to the Annenberg Public Policy Center, only a third of all Americans could name all three branches of government. And a third of Americans couldn't name any of the branches. Over half of U.S. 8th grade students could not explain the purpose of the Bill of Rights, despite the fact that the title tells us exactly what that purpose is. President Reagan reminds us that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Similarly, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor points out that knowledge of our system of governance and our rights and responsibilities as citizens is not passed along through the gene pool. Each generation of Americans must be taught these basics. And sadly, effectively preparing our students for engaged citizenship is not currently a priority in American education. To quote from the Guardian of Democracy report, "At the dawn of the 21st century, America faces many challenges, both at home and abroad. Too often, however, our democracy, the very system that should be able to address these challenges, seems to fall short. A divided citizenry, Washington gridlock, an often superficial media, and the overwhelming influence of money in politics often prevent government from serving the common good. And while there is no single solution that alone can revitalize our democracy, there is one common sense step our nation can take to strengthen it. Investing in civic learning strengthens American democracy. Here at the Annenberg Presidential Learning Center, this is our mission: to develop proactive, informed, educated, and conscientious citizens and leaders, to help develop the very sorts of students and citizens you will hear on this stage in just a few minutes. Addressing the nation in 1988, President Reagan discusses the necessary link between education and democracy. Since the founding of this nation, education and democracy have gone hand in hand. Thomas Jefferson not only wrote the Declaration of Independence and not only served as our third president, but he founded the University of Virginia, one of our most esteemed higher learning institutions. Jefferson and the founders believed that a nation that governs itself like ours must rely upon an informed and engaged electorate. So this is the framework for the work we do in education here at the Foundation. And because the cycle of civic engagement typically peaks during presidential election years, I don't know if you've watched the news recently, you've probably noticed, we wanted to create a program that allowed students across the country to be both informed and engaged. And this is where we had the tremendous fortune to meet Dr. Gordon Stables. Dr. Stables is one of our panelists on our final judging tonight, and he's the Director of Debate and Forensics at the University of Southern California's nationally recognized Trojan Debate Squad, and the first director in the history of collegiate debate to be awarded debate's 2 highest national coaching honors in the same year. We told him we'd like to celebrate civic engagement and to highlight President Reagan's reputation as the great communicator with a national series of high school debates. And he said he had a few ideas. So about a year and a half later, we had more than 2,800 students in 44 different states register to participate in school-level competitions. We partnered with 7 universities across the country and had more than 200 students participate in regional championships, including a kind of unique online regional championship that we held just last week using the Google Hangout platform. The students who participated in this series have debated everything from mandatory national service to the Electoral College to a 2-party system and more. And what we discovered was 8 of America's finest young men and women who are bright, articulate, and who can communicate effectively and intelligently about some of the most important issues facing our nation today. A new generation of Americans, and the exact same sorts of informed and engaged citizens and future leaders, our greatest Americans, from Jefferson to President Reagan to Sandra Day O'Connor, have hoped we'd cultivate. We are honored to have them on campus today, and I look forward to casting my vote for them as soon as they are legally eligible to run for office. They've been debating all day today, and now we are down to the final 2. The stakes are pretty high. The winner tonight is going to receive a $10,000 college scholarship, and thanks to our friends at the National Student Leadership Conference, all 8 of our finalists are going to receive a full scholarship to one of their outstanding student leadership programs. For those of you in the audience who this might be your first experience with watching academic debate, I want to point out a few of the key differences from what you may have seen on TV these past few weeks in the presidential debates. First, the students that you'll see tonight are prepared to debate both sides. In fact, they're sitting there now, mere minutes away from debating publicly in front of all of you, having no idea which side they're going to debate. That's going to be decided by a coin flip in just a minute here. So these students can debate either side, and that's what they've been doing all day. So when you in the audience are listening, and to our judges who are on the panel, I know sometimes it's kind of hard to disassociate yourself from your personal opinion on the matter, but that's precisely what these students are doing. They know the issue so well that they can get up here and debate either side. So those of us who work here on a daily basis in the house that the great communicator built know that there's a beauty and that there's a resonance and that there's a power in effective communication. So when you're making your decision on who you feel wins tonight, I really want you to look to the ways in which they communicate their argument. So I want to give you just a little rundown of the debate format. It's a little bit different. As you've seen on the TV debates, there's been quite a few different formats. There's the town hall format, there's the Jim Lehrer format, there's the Candy Crowley format, and these are all very different. So this is yet another different debate format. So our two students will come to the stage. They'll both have 5 minutes to make an opening argument. Then they'll have 4 minutes to rebut against the other person's argument. And then they'll have 3 minutes of crossfire, which is them just kind of firing questions right back and forth across the stage at one another. And then comes the tough test. We have a pretty heady panel of judges who, after they've interrogated each other, they will be interrogated by our judges, who are really going to kind of probe and really get to the core of their thinking and their reasoning and their logic. And then finally, they'll have 3 minutes to make a closing statement. And then that's where I'm glad I'm not one of the judges, because they're going to have a very tough decision ahead of them. So before I introduce you to our two finalists, I want to introduce our final round judging panel. So first, we have a man who has spent more than 30 years creating education programs for high school, college, and graduate students, and the CEO of the Themis Bar Review, right? You said most people say Themis as opposed to Themis. And the executive director of the National Student Leadership Conference. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rick Duffy. Next, our partner in the design and implementation of this series and the developer of the Annenberg Digital Debate Initiative, one of the leading voices in academic debate in the country today, Dr. Gordon Stables. Next, we have a lady who has many roles, all of them wonderful. Her official title is the History Social Science Consultant for the Los Angeles County Office of Education, but she's also the past president of the California Council for the Social Studies and is the current vice president of the National Council for the Social Studies. And in 2014 and 15 will be the president of the National Council for the Social Studies. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Herzog. Our next judge is someone who has quite an insider's perspective on what it means to be the great communicator. She joined the Reagan-Bush re-election campaign in 1984, answering a phone that rang in the middle of a warehouse, was recruited to work in the Office of Presidential Advance in the White House, and has been working for President Reagan ever since, including a stint as his chief of staff post-office. She is currently our chief administrative officer, and she was actually on the ground in Berlin when President Reagan told the Secretary Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Joanne Drake. And finally, our head judge this evening is a dedicated public servant who served as the mayor of Los Angeles from 1993 to 2001, and as the Secretary of Education here in California from 2003 to 2005. But his civic engagement began well before his time in office. In 1981, he created the Reardon Foundation with the goal of teaching students to read and write. Thus far, his foundation has distributed more than 20,000 computers to schools in 40 different states and has purchased more than 128,000 books for elementary school classroom libraries. He's currently the chairman of the board for the Inner City Education Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our head judge, former mayor of Los Angeles, Mr. Richard Reardon. And now, two students whose credentials in about 10 years will read kind of like the list you just heard. Our first finalist in the debate tonight is from not too far away. As I heard him say this morning, either 20 minutes without traffic or about an hour and a half with traffic, and there's always traffic. Adam Revello is a high school senior in Reseda, California. He became involved in forensics as a freshman and is now co-president of his team. He competes in impromptu, U.S. extemp, and parliamentary debate, and he was the 2012 California State Champion in impromptu. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Adam Revello to the stage. And our other finalist from our central region, Nancy Fairbank, is a high school senior who spent the first 7 years of her life living abroad before settling down in Springfield, Missouri, or Missouri, as her coach says. Nancy is involved in debate, cabinet, FBLA, Girls for Good, and ice hockey. She's also president of the Key Club and has founded the Teen to Teen organization, which supports homeless youth in her community. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Fairbank to the stage. And finally, I'm going to ask Mayor Reardon to join me on the stage for our ceremonial coin flip. And I will ask Ms. Fairbank to call it.
Let me just make a short remark.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I love trivia, and it reminds me that Reseda was the center of the Chatsworth or Northridge earthquake. So it should be called the Reseda earthquake, right? And Missouri had the biggest earthquake in the history of the United States in the early 1900s, not California. So give me the coin.
Excellent. All right.
Should we have it? Come on.
Do you guys want to stand up for the coin flip here?
Come on over. Okay. Call it.
It is heads.
I'll take con.
Heads. Who's that on there?
Okay.
Thank
yeah, thank you. And then, okay, so you are going to take the con, and you are going to take the affirmative. Do you want to be the first or second speaker?
I'd like to speak second and finish the debate.
Okay, so speaking second. So with that said, I will get off of the stage, and you will see the real stars of this evening.
Before I begin, we've had a lot of thank yous, but I'd just like to again extend my thanks to the Ronald Reagan Foundation, as well as the donors and sponsors that have made this possible, and the judges, and then my family and my coach and debate team that have made this all an incredible experience. So thank you all so much. And is everyone ready? Excellent. In 1783, Prime Minister William Pitt argued that necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants, and it is the creed of slaves. If we introduced a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution out of a false sense of necessity, we will be giving up control and restricting our liberties. It is crucial that we solve our financial issues. However, a constitutional amendment is simply not the way to do so, as it creates a stranglehold that will harm both our economic and political systems. To begin this round with some framework, I will not be offering an alternative plan to the balanced budget amendment. Rather, my burden as the negative side is simply to show that a balanced budget amendment will not help us make economic gains and will not benefit us. Rather, it can either harm us more than it benefits us, or it can do nothing at all. The Economist expands on this in August of 2011, asking, when was the last time you thought, wow, the legislation Congress just passed is so perfectly constructed, I can't imagine it ever needing to change. Support for an amendment to the Constitution is a spectacular vote of confidence in the ability of a legislator to design near-perfect legislation, because the only thing more rare than a constitutional amendment is the repealing of that amendment. A constitutional amendment would cement a policy that has the potential to greatly damage our economy. Additionally, a balanced budget amendment would actually violate the constitutional principles set by our founding fathers. Doug Kendall, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, states in July of 2011 that it's certain that the founders would be appalled by a balanced budget amendment. Keep in mind that an enumerated power of the Constitution is the ability to borrow money on the credit of the United States, as Thomas Jefferson did to make the Louisiana Purchase. Another issue is the enforcement of the balanced budget as a constitutional amendment. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities asks in November of 2011, suppose the budget is out of balance. What happens? Would the president have the unilateral power to impose balance? Can he select which programs to cut or where to increase taxes? And what about the Supreme Court? If the budget is not balanced, can it hold Congress or the president in contempt or even jail them? Can it override a presidential veto? If federal courts award claims against the United States, as they often do, with costs that would unbalance the budget, what action would those courts then be able to take? Implementing this constitutional amendment isn't just infeasible, it's impossible to do without upsetting our careful system of checks and balances. An unaccommodating, intransigent constitutional amendment is a hazardous approach, and we can see this even more clearly with historical evidence. The Guardian reports in June of 2012 that there is plenty of historical evidence showing that balanced budget policies have never worked. Mexico, Argentina, Russia, Brazil, and a number of Asian countries have all implemented this amendment, only to see their economies sink deeper into recession. The Cato Institute finds the same dilemma in November of 2011, stating that all states except for Vermont currently possess balanced budget requirements, and yet their spending continues to increase. Looking at our own national history makes the proposition seem even more absurd. Debt helped fund the War for Independence, complete the Louisiana Purchase, and preserve the Union during the Civil War. It has helped us weather the Great Depression and emerge victorious from 2 world wars. In addition, the Washington Post reports in April of 2011 that under the currently proposed balanced budget amendment, not a single year of the senior Bush administration would qualify as constitutional. The Clinton administration would have had only 2 years in which it wasn't in violation. And this amendment would have made every single year of Ronald Reagan's fiscal policy unconstitutional. What makes mainstream politicians imagine that nations would not be harmed by taking away their option to borrow and spend out of a fiscal crisis? In addition, this will cut funding for programs that help the American people, as Kathy White, the Deputy Director of the Colorado Fiscal Policy Institute, expands upon, saying that it would hurt programs like College Pell Grants, Social Security, and the Women, Infants, and Children program. It would put the economy in a straitjacket, making it impossible to address changing circumstances and crippling the ability of the federal government to operate. In addition, it has no effective enforcement mechanisms and would hurt citizens who rely on government services. History also proves that a balanced budget amendment simply does not work. A balanced budget amendment is unworkable, unwise, and unsafe, and that is why I urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Before I begin, I would like to thank the judges, the audience, and especially my opponent for making this the educational opportunity of a lifetime. Now, with that being said, I think it's important to recognize that the issue we face today is especially poignant for every single American. My opponent says that we can all agree that the debt is a large problem, but I think we need to look at a few statistics to understand the magnanimity of the situation that we're facing. The government is currently $16 trillion in debt. In fact, we go $3.88 billion more in debt every single day. It is time, as citizens, that we act. While a constitutional amendment is usually reserved for a time of crisis, I say that the crisis has reached its breaking point. And we as citizens, we need to make the choice to force our politicians to cut reckless spending so that our future generations will not be crushed under the weight of an enormous deficit. Now, to understand my position on this argument, I think we need to look at a few issues. First of all, exactly what kind of balanced budget amendment that I'm proposing. Second, we need to look at the issue of national security, which indeed must be present in this debate. But finally, we need to understand how the balanced budget amendment really is the only effective solution to this problem. Now, on that note, before we get into all of the details of my case, I want to bring up something specific that my opponent claimed. She said that her burden wasn't to offer a solution. Now, I ask you, if you as a citizen were voting for a politician, or as a senator were voting for a bill, would you vote for someone who said, yes, I agree there's a problem, but I don't have a solution? I think that the negative needs to provide some kind of a comparative analysis between her plan and a balanced budget amendment in order for us to truly have an educational debate. But that being said, let's go through exactly what I mean when I say a balanced budget amendment. Now, for me, a balanced budget amendment has really 4 key provisions. First, the idea that total expenditures can't outweigh total revenues. But how exactly do we decide what total revenues are? Well, in my mind, the way that we would do that is we would say the government can't spend any more money than it took in on average over the last 4 years. The reason that this works as a constitutional amendment is it defeats all of my opponent's arguments about this amendment being detrimental for the economy. My opponent's going to try and tell you that, well, with a balanced budget amendment, we can't deficit spend in a time of recession. However, that's simply not the case. If we are balancing the budget over 4 years, that means that at the beginning of a recession, we'll still have the revenue necessary to keep our country working. The next thing that we need to look at is the fact that a balanced budget amendment will require a 2/3 majority to be suspended. Basically, what we're getting at is the idea that if there is a national crisis, 9/11, a declaration of war, then that constitutional amendment can be suspended. By the way, Nancy, my timer just went out, so if you could let me know when I'm out of time, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Now, going on to the case of exactly why we need to deal with the national debt right now. According to the Congressional Budget Office, if we continue on today's path of reckless spending, then by 2021, our debt will be so enormous that it will take 20% of all tax revenue just to pay the interest. In fact, when you combine that number with mandatory spending, it only leaves 5% of all government revenue to pay for every single sacred duty of government. This is an extremely important issue, and it is one that indeed extends into the realm of national security. Right now, governments like China have an undue and unfair influence over ours because of the simple fact if they, at some time in the future, decided to start buying our debt, our government would no longer be able to function. That is an unacceptable risk. It is for this reason that we need to have a balanced budget amendment. We need to deal with this issue now instead of just kicking the can down the road. My opponent has made claims that a balanced budget wouldn't work and cited evidence such as the state governments. However, just because the state government's constitutional amendments don't necessarily work doesn't mean it wouldn't work on the federal level. For example, the reason why California doesn't have a balanced budget really is because they have decided to put onto their budget that they think that the federal government will give them money. This kind of accounting trick doesn't work on a federal level because there is no higher authority to which the government can look to. And again, I'm sorry, my timer went out. Please let me know if I run out of time. Okay. Well, in that case, I'll try and wrap this up as quickly as I can. Finally, my opponent claims that programs will need to be cut. However, the nature of our deficit mandates that our programs will be cut sometime in the future. The question is whether we want to take action now or kick the can further down the road and let the deficit grow, at which point things will get even worse. It is for this reason that I strongly affirm the resolution that we need a balanced budget amendment.
Is everyone ready? Excellent. There are a number of main points I'd like to address in my opponent's case. Now first, let's clarify this issue of what my burden is in the negation of today's debate. The resolution asks whether or not we should implement a balanced budget amendment in the United States Constitution. This debate is not how we can fix the economy, it's whether or not a balanced budget amendment should be implemented. And so my burden is to prove that a balanced budget should not be implemented in two ways. One, that either it does nothing, in which case we shouldn't implement it because change for the sake of change itself is no change at all. Or second, that it has more harm than good. I'm not here to present you another plan. I'm here to show you that the balanced budget amendment would harm our nation. Moving on from that burden, my opponent's first contention talks about how the balanced budget amendment would allow us to have a 2/3 majority in Congress, which we could use to raise taxes or to increase spending in times of crisis. However, I have a number of issues with this. First of all, what's to ensure that we get this 2/3 majority in Congress? Let me give you an example. If Hurricane Sandy hits the coast this weekend and causes an enormous amount of damage to the people living there, and we don't get that 2/3 majority to raise spending in order to help those people, what do? That's the exact issue with this balanced budget amendment, is it has the potential to greatly harm United States citizens by, in some cases, making it so that they do not get the federal aid that they so desperately need. Another case that we can bring up is the example of a recession. Recession lines aren't clearly defined. Yes, we know, looking back, that in 2008 we began the recession, but back then we didn't immediately recognize that this was indeed a recession. So when we need to increase federal spending to stabilize the economy during a recession and alleviate the effects, we won't necessarily be able to do so under a balanced budget amendment. The Macroeconomic Advisors Organization states in October of 2011 that if we had this balanced budget amendment during the 2008 recession, we would have lost $1.5 trillion more dollars, would have 15 million more people out of work, would have doubled the unemployment rate, and caused the economy to shrink by 17%. Those are the effects of a balanced budget amendment during a recession. Obviously, that's not good for our nation. What it does is it prevents the federal government from stabilizing the economy and using money to sort of prime the pump, as we did to get out of the Great Depression in the 1920s. And speaking of the Great Depression, let's look historically. Now, my opponent brings up the example about how states are not equivalent to the federal government. But we can see that in every aspect, when a balanced budget amendment has been implemented, it has resoundingly failed. When we look to 5 other nations, when we look to the example of 49 other states, and when we look at our own past presidential history, we can see that some of the greatest presidents, like Ronald Reagan, would have been ruled unconstitutional under this amendment. And bringing that up reminds me of the idea of enforcement. If we have a balanced budget that is ruled unconstitutional, what happens? Can we throw the president or Congress in jail? Can the president decide where we cut spending or where we raise taxes? Enforcement is a huge issue that my opponent has been unable to address. Finally, we have the idea of cutting programs that benefit the American people. My opponent advocates that we're going to need to cut these programs sometimes in the future, so why not cut them now? We have 2 options with the balanced budget amendment. One, we have to make spending cuts across the board, which is going to harm a number of programs that are absolutely crucial to continuing with our nation, like Social Security and like Medicare. The other option that we have is deciding specifically which programs to cut or to reduce funding for. But that is not going to be done effectively because of the bipartisan differences. The Democrats are going to want to cut one thing, the Republicans are going to want to cut another. So how do we determine which programs are actually reduced? Because of this multitude of issues, because this would be unsafe, I urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Now, in continuing to weigh this debate, I think there is one crucial distinction that we need to keep in mind between myself and my opponent. We both agree on the problem, but only one of us is providing a solution. Again, would you vote for a politician who said that, yes, we need to cut the debt, but didn't give you a plan on how to get out of that terrible situation? But let's pretend that you don't buy that argument. If I can show that the balanced budget amendment will at least have some benefit on our economy, some benefit for the efficacy of government, then that is a resolution that we should pass. So let's understand exactly why the balanced budget amendment indeed would benefit the people. And in order to do that, let's first refute some of the arguments that my opponent is throwing my way. Now, one of the arguments my opponent brings up is what happens in the case of a national disaster? What happens if Congress can't get a 2/3 majority? In that case, we need to look to the example of 9/11, a national tragedy that rallied the entire country. In fact, after 9/11, Congress almost unanimously supported more spending in the name of defense. The purpose of having 2/3 of Congress to require any kind of new spending is that when spending is absolutely necessary, for example, in the time of a national crisis like a hurricane, when people's lives are at risk, I firmly believe that Congress will rally around that and vote with a 2/3 majority. However, with issues that aren't so certain, issues that are perhaps only supported by 51% of our representatives, well, that's spending that probably is not absolutely imperative, which is why this plan solves its burden. It reduces the deficit by raising the level that is required to create more spending. Now, the next thing that I want to address is the fact that my opponent is claiming that the balanced budget amendment will actually have a negative effect on the economy. I'd like to reassert one of the points I made in my first speech. The fact that the way I want to define the revenue that the government spends is by averaging the revenue it's received over the past 4 years. So here's what that means. Let's say we're in year 1 of the recession. The government doesn't have to make ridiculous draconian cuts or enormous tax increases because of the fact that its revenue is defined by an average of 3 good years and 1 bad year. As the recession continues, we've stopped the falling of the economy because we could still have that initial spending. But as the recession continues, the spending is gradually lowered so we don't get into an enormous deficit and we still solve the problem of the debt. Now, the next point that I'd like to refute is the fact that my opponent is claiming that this balanced budget amendment hasn't worked in other countries and it hasn't worked in states. Yet she hasn't told you why. The reason it hasn't worked in countries like Argentina is because of the fact that their economy is fundamentally flawed. The reason it hasn't worked on a state level is because often the way states balance their budgets is by saying we're going to get federal aid, like California did, when it balanced its budget by saying that they were going to get $5.3 billion in financial aid from the federal government, when in fact they only got $1.3 billion. Because those budgetary tricks aren't available to the federal government, and because our economy is much more fundamentally sound than Argentina's, the balanced budget amendment indeed has the potential to work. But in finally understanding why we need to pass the balanced budget amendment, we need to understand the idea of cutting now as opposed to cutting in the future. My opponent did not refute the fact that we will indeed need to cut these social programs at some point, or at the very least reform them. I think that what we need to do is stop the United States before we become Greece. Problems in the European Union have come from the fact that they waited until the absolute crisis point, the last minute, to try and make reform. We need to make reform now before the problem gets so out of hand that there will never be hope of getting out of the deficit. It is for all of these reasons why I would urge you to vote affirmative on this resolution. Thank you. Would you like the first question?
Yes, please. Thank you. All right, so you talk about how in your balanced budget amendment plan, you would average revenue over the past 4 years and then use that as a predictor of the GDP in the next year. However, say we were in a recession for 4 years and that next year we got out of that recession. How can this be an accurate predictor for future income?
Well, I think that the real argument here is the fact that you're basically making a case for Keynesian economics, the idea that when the economy is in free fall, we have to spend to cushion that fall. But even Keynes himself didn't argue that we needed to spend all the way throughout the business cycle. Indeed, we can't sustainably spend our way out of a recession. But I do agree that sometimes it's necessary to cushion that initial fall. This balanced budget amendment leaves enough space for government to cushion that fall without having a lot of tax increases or layoffs.
Sure, but you're not answering my question. My question is whether or not we could use the past 4 years as an actual accurate measure of the prediction of the next year's income. Can you clarify that for me, please?
Sure. I think that we need to understand that the purpose of the balanced budget amendment, as has been laid out in the numerous times it's been proposed, is to cut deficit. No one is going to actually claim that we can balance the budget down to the last cent. What we need to do is get as close as is humanly possible. Now, there are 2 ways to get close. One, you try and project how much money you're going to get. The only problem is if you look at the projections that Republicans are saying Obamacare will cost compared to the projections that Democrats say Obamacare will cost, a difference which is, by the way, about $1 trillion, it's clear that projections are almost never accurate. Thus, the most accurate way that we can predict revenue is by averaging the last 4 years of income.
But see, that's a big flaw that I think that the balanced budget amendment has, is you say that you want to balance the budget to the closest cent possible, but if we're using inaccurate predictors to do so, we're not going to have a balanced budget at all. Do you have a question?
I would like to ask you, how can we expect to compare the balanced budget amendment to anything if you're not proposing any kind of legislative solution?
Let's clarify this right now. Now, the resolution asks whether or not we should add a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. If I can prove to you today that adding that to the Constitution would either be completely ineffective or would harm us more than help us, then I've met my burden. We're not arguing what's the best way to help the economy. I'm not here to offer you a plan. I'm in negation. I'm simply saying that a balanced budget amendment is going to hurt Americans. That's my burden, and that's what I'm arguing today.
But if you haven't refuted the fact that our government will very soon collapse under the weight of an enormous debt, and you're not proposing any other way to get out of that enormous debt, then how can we be expected to compare the balanced budget to anything?
Here's the thing. We have this potential of collapse, and we have all these fiscal issues. But if I can show that a balanced budget amendment won't solve those issues, and then it shouldn't be implemented, I've met the resolution. That's clarified. Now I have another question for you. When we look specifically at the issue of using other nations as a comparison to what a balanced... Oh, we're out of time. I'll ask it in my next speech. Thanks.
Sure thing.
Adam, go ahead.
Would you like me to answer a question?
Or ask. Should she be asking a question?
I was under the impression that it was time for you to ask us the questions.
Sorry, it's our turn as the panel to take that. We've deferred Mayor Reardon.
Question is that the Federal Reserve buys about 75% of all government bonds every year. Or put more simply, they print about $1 trillion a year in money. And I'll ask Nancy, do you think that might bring about inflation?
I absolutely think that that has the potential to bring about inflation. The issue that I have with a balanced budget amendment, though, is because we have this capacity as the Federal Reserve to print money, we can say that we're balancing our budget, but simply increase our income by printing more money. And that's, I think, a problem with the balanced budget amendment, is it has this capacity for gimmicks and loopholes like we found on the state level. And if we do so, if we use those gimmicks, then we are going to see increased inflation and problems across the board. Thanks.
Adam, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd like to point out that when it comes to printing government bonds, that is debt that we have on our balance sheet, so I wouldn't exactly call that a budget gimmick. But the second point that I'd like to make is, once again, we have to understand the fact that the problem only gets worse when you kick the can down the road. The longer we have this enormous debt, the more economic disadvantages are going to come from it. Thus, we need to deal with the problem right now, and the best way to do that, the swiftest solution, is the balanced budget amendment.
Joanne?
I'd like to ask Nancy, you stated that a balanced budget amendment violates the constitutional principles that were set by our founders. Can you explain that?
Sure. One of the constitutional principles that is actually in our Constitution, set by our founding fathers, gives the United States the capacity to borrow money on the credit of our nation. So when we're looking at that as a constitutional principle, that we have the ability to borrow money and the ability to get into debt. Another example I can give you is Thomas Jefferson, who got us into debt in order to make the Louisiana Purchase, which was an investment for the future. The founding fathers believed that the deficit could be a good thing when used wisely to promote future investments or to deal with crises. So when we're looking at what actually fits the founding fathers' principles and also our actual Constitution as it stands, we have to see that it is not the balanced budget amendment. Thank you.
Adam, do you have a response to that?
I do. Well, I'd like to make 3 points there. First of all, our government has a fantastic history of amending the Constitution. The point of an amendment in the Constitution is to contradict what is currently in the document. I'll give a great example of that. In the original Constitution, the Founding Fathers sanctified the slave trade for 50 years. It was only through the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments that they were able to rectify that mistake. I don't think that by virtue of simply contradicting the current doctrine of the Constitution, we should vote down the balanced budget amendment, considering our history of good reform to the Constitution. The second point I'd like to make is the example of Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. Again, part of the balanced budget is when there is an extreme opportunity for investment so blatant, such as the Louisiana Purchase was, we can deficit spend through a 2/3 majority. So in Thomas Jefferson's time, the Louisiana Purchase would have still been feasible. The last point I'd like to make is that it's almost unfair to compare the days of the Founding Fathers to the current times. When the Founding Fathers were around, we weren't 10 years away from spending 95% of all tax revenue on mandatory spending and interest. Thus, I think we need to approach it from a slightly different perspective.
I have a follow-up question, and this is to both of you. You are about to be, or you already are, 18 years old and about to be able to cast your first vote in a national election. If it's not this one, it's the next one. If a balanced budget amendment were on the ballot, the first time you get to vote, would you vote for it or against it?
Well, I would absolutely vote for it.
I've struggled with this. When I originally looked at this topic, I was completely against it from the get-go. After doing a lot more research, I definitely think that there are merits to a balanced budget, and I think those are good. However, I would say that overall, I would really advocate for fiscal policy with teeth rather than actually putting it as a constitutional amendment. So I don't know if I would vote for them as a constitutional amendment, but certainly I'm an advocate for the idea of a balanced budget.
Thank you.
I think there are a few who would disagree that having a balanced budget is a good thing. I think the difficulty comes in how to achieving that, and we have all seen that that has become very heated, very partisan, what to spend on, what not to spend on, how to increase revenue or not to increase revenue. How do you see this type of argument, discussion, controversy impacted or not impacted by a constitutional amendment to balance the budget or not? Would it have any impact on that larger picture in achieving what we all want to achieve?
I think that putting it in the form of a constitutional amendment really alters it structurally. I think that, for example, if you go against the Constitution, you have the ability to sue the federal government. So I've read a lot of evidence saying that this would create thousands of lawsuits as people sue the federal government if they don't balance the budget. And in addition to that, say the budget isn't balanced and someone sues the federal government. Well, that's going to take 2 to 3 years to get up to the Supreme Court, and by the time it's there, that budget will already have been completed for that year. So I think that a huge issue with making it a constitutional amendment rather than just an idea we back with fiscal policy is the fact that there are so many enforcement issues with it being part of the Constitution that I think that it simply makes it unfeasible.
In response to both what you're saying in your initial question about how a balanced budget amendment would impact our current political process, in my mind, politicians have 2 goals. One is to get the support of special interests because they help them get elected, but 2, and more importantly, to get the support of constituency, which, while you want special interests to support you in order for you to get campaign funds, you can't get elected without the support of your constituency. What I'm getting at is right now, without a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget, politicians have the opportunity to have both options. Right now, there are 9,000 cases of pork barrel spending each year. There are also a lot of spending that benefit the American people. And I truly believe that when forced to choose between special interest and their constituency, seeing as how they can't get elected without their constituency, politicians will get the kick in the right direction to get rid of all that wasteful spending so they can still be reelected by their constituency.
If I could maybe extend the conversation a bit in the direction that Dr. Herzog initiated, which is, it seems that both parties have acknowledged, and I think, Adam, you just referenced this a little bit, the conflicting demands of governance and then fiscal responsibility. I guess the question I'd like to pose to both of you is, how do you, when the constitutional amendment is adopted, the successful ones change the nature of our national discussion? They outline core principles that we as a people and as a society hold to be essential. When there are unfortunately unsuccessful constitutional amendments, history judges them poorly because we move too quickly. And I'd like for both of you to speak a little bit about why you think either this would be the type of major reform of society which would be effective, or that type of short-lived moment of recrimination.
Sure. In my very first speech, I brought to you with the opening quote this idea of liberty and limiting liberties out of this false idea of necessity and how dangerous that is. And I think that if you just look at a core principle of liberty, that a balanced budget amendment absolutely undermines that principle. What we're basically doing with this amendment is we're limiting our choices. And because of that, it has the great potential to harm the American people. As I brought up with the idea of a crisis, if we have a hurricane and we don't achieve that congressional supermajority, and by the way, that supermajority ensures that another constitutional principle isn't met because it creates the rule of the minority. So if slightly over 1/3 of Congress decides not to vote on this issue, then we will have that rule of the minority. But if that congressional majority isn't met for a crisis and the American people suffer because of it, I think it's undermining our liberty. And thus, I don't see that a balanced budget amendment is positive for the United States.
Well, obviously I disagree, and I think that a balanced budget amendment would be looked at in the same way that we look at things like the 10 original amendments of the Bill of Rights and also the amendments that abolished slavery and granted equity to people of color. But in explaining exactly why I think that, the way that I look at this round is, yeah, there are going to have to be some tough choices in the short term. But the reason I think that history will view this amendment in a kind light is because I hope that at the point when I have children, I will be able to sit down with them and point in their history books and say, that was the point. That was the point when we were on the precipice of being crushed by national debt and we turned back.
Nancy, you said during the debate that we should support your plan or because otherwise the bipartisan differences would result with a constitutional amendment that it would never work. Adam, you said that we needed to support the constitutional amendment because otherwise, if we supported her plan, that we'd be merely kicking the can down the road. So, in effect, you both were using the same argument against the other person's position. And the first question I guess I have for both of you is, what happens if neither plan works?
Well, that's a very difficult question because I have a lot of faith that the balanced budget amendment will work. But one point that I'd like to make there is analyzing kind of the language of that question you just used. You said, well, we're comparing my plan to her plan. The important thing there is my opponent hasn't proposed a plan, which means that I'm assuming she's basically arguing for what's going on in the status quo. What's going on in the status quo is when we had that debt ceiling debate a few months ago, the solution Congress came up with was, let's kick the can down the road another 6 months. So that's basically the argument I'm assuming my opponent is supporting, given the fact that she hasn't articulated any other position.
First of all, I'd like to re-clarify the fact that my burden is to simply show that a balanced budget amendment will be ineffective. And I've talked about that a lot, but your question specifically alludes to what happens if it isn't implemented. And honestly, I think that our nation does have severe fiscal issues. We have problems limiting our spending. We have a lot of government waste, but we also have core programs that we need to continue supporting, like education. That's a lot what this debate is about, like Social Security, like Medicare. I think that without the balanced budget amendment, we're still going to have those fiscal problems. But I think that the balanced budget amendment won't solve those problems and has the potential to make them far worse.
Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Excellent. There are a few main key voter issues in today's debate. One, the idea of will the balanced budget amendment actually help our fiscal situation? And two, does the balanced budget amendment have the potential to further damage our economy and political systems? Now, moving to my first question, again, my burden is to simply prove that a balanced budget amendment will not be effective and thus that we should not add it to the United States Constitution. And I've shown that it won't be effective in a number of ways. First of all, my opponent has never addressed the crucial issues with enforcement. What happens? Can the Supreme Court put the president in jail? When federal courts award money to constituents that sue against the United States and it unbalances the budget, what will those courts then do? There are so many enforcement issues with this amendment that it simply isn't feasible. And it also undermines our system of checks and balances in the government that is a key part of our governmental structure. Now, moving on from there, we also have to see that my opponent's plan is not feasible in itself because he takes the average revenue of the last 4 years as a predictor for our future income. But if you're looking at the last 4 years of a recession or of extreme growth, and then you have the opposite happen in the next year, you can see that that simply isn't an accurate predictor because our GDP can fluctuate so much in a number of given years. If we're basing a balanced budget amendment off of an inaccurate predictor, what's the point in having it at all? Additionally, we have to see that there is a number of problems with the fact that a balanced budget amendment would hinge on a 2/3 congressional majority. Again, what if we're in a time of crisis and that congressional majority does not vote to increase federal spending? What will the American people do? The fact is that this specific part of the amendment has the potential for severe harm for the people of our nation. In addition, while my opponent says that we can eliminate this balanced budget amendment in times of war or times of recession, recession generally isn't clearly defined, and neither is war. We can have specific acts of war, but especially with the terrorism going on in this century, we can see that it is quite questionable when we are in a time of war or when we are in a time of recession and when government spending is needed. Additionally, we have to see that when we look historically, we can see 3 different examples of why the balanced budget amendment simply won't work. It hasn't worked in 49 states. It hasn't worked in 5 different nations. And it would have made all 4 years of Ronald Reagan's fiscal policy unconstitutional. Is that the type of policy we want to have for our government? And in addition, a balanced budget amendment will cut programs that help the American people, like education, like Medicare, like Social Security. It will eliminate key tenets of our government that is supporting the people of our nation. Overall, when we look at a balanced budget amendment, we can see it's not effective and that it does more harm than good. This amendment is unworkable, unwise, and unsafe. Thus, I urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Now, there have been a lot of arguments that have gone back and forth in this debate. And it is my job in this final speech to clarify this entire round for you to show exactly why we need a balanced budget amendment. And to do that, I think we need to keep one central issue in mind. The fact that this debate boils down to a matter of courage. My opponent's case hinders on using scare tactics to tell you that we can't pass this balanced budget amendment because it will have these negative impacts right now. However, I'm here to tell you that if we don't pass that balanced budget amendment, the impacts that will happen in the future will far outweigh the detriments of the present. I want to be able to tell my kids and my grandkids when I'm sitting down and going through their history books that this was the moment when we chose to step back from the precipice. But my opponent proposes no such plan. Her plan is basically to go with the same failed policies that have gotten us into this mess. Thus, we need to look to exactly what my opponent has said and how she really fundamentally agrees with me. She has not refuted that our government cannot function if 95% of our revenue is used on interest payments and mandatory spending. She, in her own words, has said that her only burden in this debate is to prove that my plan has no merits. But when questioned about whether she would vote for a balanced budget amendment or not, in her own words, she admitted that it had some merits. By her own standards, she has admitted that this is something we should do. Now, we need to also look to something else, she said. The fact that this is enforced through the judicial branch through the lawsuits against the federal government if they fail the sacred duty of balancing the budget. We have to look to her arguments about a time of crisis. When there is a true crisis that faces this nation, We will rally around and achieve the necessary 2/3 majority in order to ensure that action is taken. But it also ensures that reckless spending is not also doled out. We need to reduce the deficit, and this balanced budget amendment is the best way to do that. The final point that I'd like to make is the fact that my opponent is trying to tell you that all of these programs in the short term will be cut unless we pass this plan. However, in the long term, our interest payments are piling up. The longer we wait, the higher those interest rates go, which means the problem is getting exponentially worse every time we kick the can down the road, the plan that my opponent is basically proposing. Ronald Reagan once said that freedom is always just one generation away from extinction. We are that generation. Because if we do not take action now, and if that action is not swift and immediate, then, as my opponent has conceded, our government will be crushed under the weight of an immense debt. It is for those reasons that I would urge a vote in favor of a balanced budget amendment. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming to the end, but I've just been wanting to ask a question, and then you're going to sit down and we will decide who the winner is. But Ronald Reagan said that the war on poverty was adopted in 1960, but by the 1980s, poverty had won the war. What was he talking about?
Well, I think he was probably referring to the idea that throughout our history, we have been trying to combat the inequity that seems to plague our society. And at the when the 1980s were happening, that inequity had reached a high point.
I think that what Ronald Reagan was referring to was the fact that in America, unfortunately, though we are the land of the free, and though we are hailed as one of the strongest nations in the world, we still have poverty. We have teenagers that are homeless. We have drug addicts that need programs. We still have poverty, even though we are this great nation. And I think that Ronald Reagan found that with the policies that were implemented in that 20 years, they weren't enough. They weren't enough to combat the issues that have plagued us continuously throughout our history. And I hope that for the future, we can change and that we can restart this war on poverty and eventually overcome it. But I believe that is what Ronald Reagan was talking about in that quote.
Okay, take your seats for a few minutes. We would like to go into another room or something.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is, I feel horrible. I was a teacher for a decade, and I feel horrible because what I'm about to do is going to be agonizing to our two competitors, and I'm just going to ask them to sit and wait for just a little while we have a discussion. I want to kind of pull back a little bit from this intense, amazing discussion. I mean, can you believe that those were two high school students? Let's give them another round of applause. And I think that some way, our ultimate winner here tonight is the audience who got to sit in and see that. And I, for one, that was the most inspiring debate that I've seen this political election season. And I wish that all of them were like that. So, wonderful job. So now I want to pull back from this kind of specific instance of what amazing civic education looks like. and have a discussion. I'm going to invite 3 of our judges up to the stage. We're going to have kind of a brief discussion on leadership and civic engagement, and how we might look at that, not just in this particular instance, but as in society as a whole. So if I could ask Mayor Reardon, Dr. Herzog, and Dr. Stables to please join me on stage. Is the table placement okay? Just want to make sure we can see this with the pillar there. How's it? Video? This is a good place for it. Mayor Reardon, if you want to sit there. There you go. There you go. I'll sit here. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And so the first thing I want to pose, and this is a question for Mayor Reardon. You have had quite a civically engaged life. And so when I look at what the students did here tonight, it seems that, this could be a potential spark moment of what civic engagement look like. So I wanted to ask you, what was your first kind of foundational civic engagement moment where you realized that you wanted to lead a life dedicated to public service?
Well, I think the first thing I did was become part of the United Way. This is when I was a 26-year-old lawyer, and I was with the firm of O'Melveny and Myers, and all of the senior partners there were involved in inner city projects and things, and it was a great model for me as a young lawyer. From there, I went on to, be involved in many, many things, and then remember there was a study called The Nation at Risk, and that study, among other things, said that if a child cannot read and write fluently by the end of the 2nd grade, you've lost that child for life. So I made the rest of my life aimed at teaching every kid to read and write fluently by the end of the 2nd grade.
Excellent. And I know that that's the work of the Reardon Foundation. Could you tell us a
Right.
little bit more about some of the work that you've done to address those reading and writing problems?
Well, we have a software package called Writing to Read, and we put kids literally in kindergarten through 2nd grade on computers, and it's much easier for a kindergarten kid to press the letter A on a computer than to write it physically. And you have, various games that you play with the kids on the computer, but there are in the English language, there are 42 phonemes or sounds. And every word in the English language is made up of some combination of those sounds. And what it does, it plays with these kids to learn those sounds, to write the sounds down, and then they can write anything they want, anything they say, they can write in those sounds. Now, it looks like a foreign language to us, but today it gives them the confidence that they can express themselves. And then the other half of the program is to teach them to spell correctly.
Excellent. So it sounds in some ways like you're saying the roots of effective communication start very, very early.
Yeah, another very interesting statistic is a child can learn to speak a foreign language fluently best between 18 months old and 6 years old. Much quicker than any of us can.
Oh, absolutely. And so from that beginning that you had as part of the United Way, you've had a long career of public service, not just in elected office and appointed office, but in your nonprofit work and your continual kind of advocacy for issues that you're interested in. What is it that motivates you to continue to stay so civically engaged?
Well, I think God has put me on this earth thinking that every child that's born has a right to a quality education and quality health care. And I believe that very, very strongly. I also believe that people like myself who were able to get a law degree from an excellent law school and able to get, to do well in my business, have a duty to help others. And there is a fellow, Rabbi Hillel, I don't know if you ever heard that name, who said, if not now, when? If not me, who? And so my whole life is a problem comes, and I said, when should that be solved and who should solve it? And then I look at myself in the mirror.
Absolutely, that's a great. So obviously, you've proven yourself. You're an amazing leader, not only of the city of Los Angeles, but in your other work. Now, I've heard that you have some axioms on leadership and what it takes to make someone an effective leader.
I teach leadership at UCLA Business School, and the axioms I have are courage, the courage to make decisions. The corollary of that is only a mediocre person never makes a mistake. And then I have caring about others. Learn from everybody. Care from the janitor, the president of a company. Learn from them, care for them. And then one of the most important, because very few politicians do this, is empowering others. You have to, as a leader at the top, you have to empower the people under you and not stay on top of them all the time. And then relentless pursuit of goals, or be a closer. You make things happen, you close, you get to your goal. And then the last, which is a little debatable, is something that Reagan had a lot of, is a sense of humor.
You were actually telling a story about an incident you had with President Reagan. Do you mind sharing that? Or before?
Yeah, I played golf after he was president a number of times with him, and we were at the Hillcrest Country Club. It was a Jewish country club in L.A., and we were having lunch, and George Burns walked by smoking a cigar. And Reagan said, "George, what are you doing? How many cigars a day do you smoke?" And he said, "Oh, about 6. He says, "I understand you drink martinis too." He said, "Oh, about 4 or 5. And Reagan said, "My doctor won't let me smoke or drink anything. What does your doctor tell you, George?" And George goes like this, "He's dead."
Well, that's a great story. So in working with your students at UCLA, you must have they taught you anything about leadership? I would imagine you have many, many things you can teach them about leadership, but have they ever taught you anything about leadership?
I think I think a lot, because these kids somehow magically, a very high percentage of them want to get into helping poor children, get into charities for the first few years. And I teach them, I say, the first thing you do is get a solid job and then take that and apply that to helping charities. Well, I want to say one other thing about Reagan. Roger Ailes, who wrote the book about, he was the one that ran Reagan's campaigns. And he said, if you give a speech, the first thing that you want the listeners to think of is that they like you. Not that you're brilliant or anything, but they like you. And that had a really profound effect on me.
What did you think? So just kind of zooming back to what happened here tonight, anything about leadership or kind of that effective communication that you saw in our competitors tonight?
I think I think maybe with a little bit that they didn't strive to have the other person like them or the audience like them. And I think knocking the opponent is not smart politics. Yeah. Make the point, make your point, which is the opposite of what the opponent's point is, but don't, apply it to them.
Okay. Now, I want to turn my next question to Dr. Stables, who's here. So in speaking about engaged citizens, effective leaders, one of the things that we know, both from the legacy of President Reagan and from what we know about great leaders, is they're effective communicators. Now, in your position as director of debate and someone who is more passionate about debate than anyone I've ever met, what is it about debate that helps us create these effective, engaged, and informed citizens?
Well, it's a great question, and luckily I was able to come after this fantastic presentation tonight, so I have a little bit of evidence before I even begin to explain it. But I think in the lifetime of experience that I've had, starting with being a high school student who was not nearly as talented as the young people we saw on the stage tonight, but was exposed to some of the same ideas, I think it provides the rare moment where we take the competition that so many of us love and enjoy and watch. And so when we look at the presidential debates, and if they conflict with a Monday Night Football game or a World Series game, we know where the ratings are going to go. And that doesn't mean we're not interested in politics, but we also are very passionate about our teams and our competition. Debate as an academic competition provides that spark, and it encourages young people to say, you really want to get motivated to learn about executive authority, or you want to prepare for a balanced budget amendment debate. things in their life that may or may not be directly relevant, although you heard tonight they certainly can draw connections. But the idea of taking competition, which can be great and can be dangerous, if harnessed in the right way, it provides an academic environment where I think, as Mayor Reardon described, where they're active and they're empowered to be engaged. They drive the conversation. We didn't need a moderator tonight. We didn't need anyone else to move the conversation. They drove it because of their research and their interests. And I think as we go ahead as a society and the ways that we receive information change, for most of us, I think we can probably understand that our daily news routine has undergone dramatic revision, whether your paper no longer delivers on a daily basis, whether it's still a paper, whether the network that you watch has news at the time that you watch, whether they're still considered a network. And the young people of today are going through a dramatic revolution, maybe unseen in almost any other part in human history, where they change not only the type of information, but the volume of information. And so debate provides a lever, like when we talked about this program 2 years ago, to say, we can certainly get thousands of high school students across the country talking about civic issues, give them a little bit of a stake, give them a little bit of encouragement, and then get out of the way, because they'll do remarkable things. So debate's a remarkable engine of learning that way.
So following up on that debate question, I know you've been in the news, recently commenting on some of the presidential debates, and you have some pretty obviously informed opinions about debate. I was wondering if what you saw here from the students tonight, if you would offer our candidates any lessons they could learn from what we saw from our students.
I think the biggest part is to trust in the ability of talented people to make good arguments. And I made the reference about the moderators. I think we can all express, and I know we definitely had some shared frustrations about some of the reactions in the debates, but I take a longer view to say I think I'm, a little naive and a little enthusiastic enough to believe that if we continue to have faith in public debates, they can resemble this tonight, which is more of the people that we trust to hold high office engaging each other. I know it was frustrating in this last cycle, and I know there were moments that all of us would like to have had a more civil exchange between the candidates. But when you look at the history of presidential debates, we're actually seeing the most engaged debates between the two people that we're choosing to serve in the highest position. We can go not that long ago, and I'm sure Mayor Reardon can explain stories where the moderators drove the conversation. They were the only ones dynamic and influencing it, and the candidates were almost restrained to engage each other. And I think that it takes a lot of trust and a lot of confidence in the process, but the more that they engage each other, the better we are, because we hear from them. Aristotle had a great way of thinking about the importance of invention. Aristotle didn't believe that everything was a fact that necessarily you drew from it. It was the way you organized, the way you distilled it, the way you developed your idea. And when you listen to someone express an opinion about a candidate or a student after a debate, it's because you understand, maybe you've heard that tidbit of information before, but not in the same way or the same example and the same reference. So I think maybe the lesson going forward is the more that we can have engaging the candidates, the issues, the better off we are. And ultimately, like I think the best way to describe it as a bad debate is still much better than an unlimited world of advertising. And I think we saw that if you live in Ohio, you would need 80 days to watch every advertisement that's been purchased on the air to run in your area. So when folks tell me these 4 debates weren't very good, I can agree. And I'd say, but if we had 8 and maybe we could take the time from advertising, I think we'd be a lot better off.
Let me just comment on that. I think what you saw in the presidential campaigns is people went away not liking either of them. And I think if one of them had just kept themselves likable, they would have hands down won the debate.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to now turn to Dr. Herzog here. So you are one of the leading advocates for civic education in the country. I know I've worked with you extensively over the past couple of years and know how passionate you are about how important civic education is. And the fact is, it's not a major issue in education right now. So I was wondering if you could tell our audience, give us a little kind of perspective on what's going on with civic education and why you think it's not the issue that maybe it should be.
Well, thank you, Tony. A lot of places to start with that, and I'm so glad you talked about the importance of kids learning to read and write and understand mathematics and those basic skills. And we're finding that a lot of dialogue in schools today is that we're struggling even with that. We're not properly preparing kids for college and career. We're falling behind in comparison to other countries. And that's what's kind of sparked this Common Core State Standards initiative, which is an attempt to get there.
But Tony and I will often argue to audiences that it's one thing to prepare kids for college and career, but we need to be dedicated to preparing them for citizenship as well. Because wherever they land in whatever job or college, if you're living in these United States, if you're living within this great democracy, you have rights and responsibilities to engage in that and have your voice heard. You know, when you travel or you watch the news around other countries around the world, it makes you appreciate what we have here. The freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, all of these First Amendment rights and all we have. But if our schools aren't dedicated to teaching them to our young people and embracing them, and not only memorizing how does a bill become a law, I'm not even talking about that. That's minor stuff. That's multiple choice test stuff. But what are the skills you need to engage actively in a democracy? And what we saw tonight demonstrates that. And I think we're in a crisis point, really, because when you talk to people who have worked in Washington, D.C. over the years, they're seeing a transition from the years in the 80s and 90s, where people always disagreed, but there was more, it seemed like there was more of an effort to reach across the aisle, to reach consensus, to respect other people's point of views. You may not agree, but I agree to disagree, and that was the end of it. And we're seeing a lack of that kind of working toward consensus, working together, even though we disagree. And I think that's caused a lot of the general public to be very distrustful of government, to become apathetic about voting and being involved. And so the civic engagement of the general public levels are going down. And so if we don't dedicate energy in schools to educate young people on what does it mean to have the knowledge, skills, and dispositions, I think the future of our democracy is really at peril. And I have to really say something about Tony Pennay and Janet Tran and the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Presidential Center. They are amazing at getting behind this effort and supporting this effort. The fact that we had this here, the fact that you invited me, of all people, to be here. I mean, I wish you knew these people and the dedication and the hours and hours they're dedicating to this and running around the country and speaking. Tony was an award recipient this year of the California Council for the Social Studies Civic Action Award because of his work in this effort. And I think it's organizations like this, Tony's work, Janet's work, is really helping us get some groundswell moving forward. We're also very lucky, and this is good news too, some things are starting to move a little bit even in California. Our California Chief Justice, Cantil Sakayue, has made it one of her visions and focus of the entire judicial branch to support civic learning. Now that's not what they signed up to do, that's not their primary job, but she is hosting a statewide summit in February, and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor is coming. She is co-sponsoring a brand new, hot off the press, Civic Learning Award for California high schools with Superintendent Torlakson. I have a few forms down here if there's any high school folks. So there's some good news, there's some things that are starting to bubble up, but it's thanks to people like Tony and Janet and all of you here and these students. This is giving us hope. Because one of the most promising practices, proven practices for civic engagement is that ability to discuss controversial issues with civility, with respect, and have meaningful dialogue. And I think what we saw here demonstrated some of that. So
absolutely.
We have a lot of work to do, as you know, Tony.
Yeah, I mean,
but this is a great example.
Yeah, the two students who are here tonight, I mean, literally had 2 weeks to prepare a very informed discussion on constitutional issues and fiscal policy. And imagine what could happen if that was applied over the course of a year or over the course of K-12 study. I mean, it's,
And it's a real skill. It's not so much your knowledge of the subject, but like what you work with every day, your ability to put out the points of view, backed with evidence, cogent responses. That's an intelligent way to engage in democracy, rather than, I hate that, I think I'll walk out of school today because it's stupid, you know. You need to be looking at these issues in intelligent ways, and this is greatly demonstrated, so very exciting.
Okay, so kind of following up on that, how do you think, this is a question for the entire panel, I'll start with you, Mayor Reardon. How do you think that schools could encourage students to become more civic-minded and active in their communities?
I think to have professors like myself or from USC, others come and talk to the students. My first thought was to have elected officials talk to them, but I don't have any respect for elected officials, including myself. But I think you have to teach basic things like don't be an ideologue in life. Respect somebody else's point of view, even if you disagree with them. And this is your point, of course. And I think you have to get that into their brain and everything. And you have to talk about how do you make things happen? How do you get around bureaucratic things? I'll just leave it with the one thing I did in LA and I felt proud of was empowering other people. After the Northridge earthquake, we got around and we empowered every citizen to just do things. Forget city government for everything. Just get your business going, get your house rebuilt, and everything else. And it worked beautifully.
So, thank you. Dr. Herzog, same question. What could schools do?
I think this discussion of controversial issues is one of the hardest things to do in classrooms, and most schools will back away from that because it's controversial and it's difficult. How do you moderate that? How do you navigate that without, losing your job and who knows what else that could? It's very hard. Yeah. So if you have bold leadership in schools and principals and superintendents who say, this is important, where can we go to figure out how to do this and teach our students how to do this? That's, I think, the single most powerful thing we can do. I'm just thinking about, Thanksgiving's coming up. And I bet in most families there's going to be somebody sitting at that table you're not going to agree with on something. But you're going to, okay, but yeah, that too. But anyway, you're going to stay seated at that table and you're going to have that meal together and you're going to find some common ground. And you may grossly disagree on an issue or something, but there's some compelling reason for you to stay together and work together and have a common experience without giving up your personal values and ideas. So that, to me, is what symbolizes democracy, and how can we understand those different points of views, make sense of them, and come together and live peacefully to solve problems.
Excellent. Dr. Steele, same question.
The one thing that really comes to my mind, and it's consistent with what you both just explained, is that our students are remarkably talented people who need to be encouraged and empowered to connect the things that they see, the things that they care about, the things that they observe, and encourage them that they can make differences. One small example we see all the time with research, and I'm sure everyone who's a parent or a classroom teacher in here has had the Wikipedia problem. The student does research, and of course, the first algorithm hit is a Wikipedia entry for the site. And we have this discussion and back and forth. And for those of us that are old enough to remember encyclopedias, which were, the awkward, scary cousins of the Wikipedia in that way, remember that it wasn't the information was perfect, but really what we said is that there's a way to react and relate to it. The encyclopedia was not perfect, but it was part of the answer, and we needed to find the rest of it. One of the things that I find about encouraging is that for all of the people and students that I work with and encounter who have seen a Wikipedia page, how many of them have been taught and encouraged to edit that Wikipedia page? And you go from passive learning to active learning. If every student researching a topic in the country about the balanced budget amendment clicked on the second tab of the page, the talk or edit page, and made those adjustments, used the research that we saw tonight, that means every other person who looks at that page, who does that same search in the future, benefits from that collective wisdom and judgment of the folks that have gone before it. And that's any person with any internet connection anywhere in the world can be part of that. There are these moments that for those of us who remember growing up being fragmented and disconnected, we didn't have the ability to influence what anyone else in the world thought or knew or understood about an issue. And there's lots of examples like this. Hyper-local journalism, people reporting on news in their community that matters to them. Encourage people to recognize and take advantage of these tools. I said, our young people are amazing today. We just have to recognize the good that we know, that the encyclopedia wasn't everything, but to not dissuade them from saying, well, don't look online. That's not an effective answer either.
Excellent. Well, your comment on Wikipedia brings me to my final question, because I think our students have been waiting long enough, and I want to get back to them. But my final question is, the title of this debate series was the Ronald Reagan Great Communicator Debate Series. And communication has evolved so drastically in the past decade even the past 5 years, with the introduction of things like social media and 140 character talking points and things like that. So I wanted to ask you my final question about the effect of social media on public discourse. And I'll start here with Dr. Stables, who I know has done a lot of interesting work in debate and media and things like that, and we'll kind of work our way down to Mayor Reardon.
Well, I think the biggest thing that I would encourage everyone to consider is that it's easy to read history and recognize that this is the worst and this is the least possible and the least optimistic. But if you look at a navigated view of history, sometimes that you find that we're not the first people to have gone through similar challenges. We do have a crisis in public and private media, which communicates what is responsible, what is effective, and what we're using, but we're not the first ones to do so. Newspapers were not treated, and through most of American and world history, newspapers were not treated as the reverent, non-ideological perspective. All of us that remember the phrase yellow journalism, we're thinking about newspapers intentionally printed for partisan, narrow interests. And when I think, and I read a lot of the complaints of social media and where media is today, I think you could easily map it onto a time where, let's be frank about it, when media only has an economic interest, the people producing that are not doing anything wrong to produce something that the readers will want to read. There's lots of media organizations that can learn from that experience. The difference is that we're coming out of a period of time where we all valorize public media. We valorize that the advent of television introduced the idea of public service requirements, the idea that there were public broadcasting and components that changed. And so for us, the part that I think we need to navigate is what's the public good in our new media? And for those of us that are old enough to remember changes in media, we have to pass along those values to the young people. And young people need to engage to consider that, and this is to your point exactly, if we're only educating individuals as consumers, we're not doing the whole job. We need to engage and educate them as citizens to say, what will the public media be for social media to produce a public good? I think it's in the scope of world history, we're the first people where the average person could ask a question to their leader. That doesn't happen in world history. Now, that may not be a great question, it may be a great dialogue, but it means we can't be satisfied with that change any more than we can look up and say that this is an impossible future.
So I'd like to know how many people in this room either tweeted or Facebooked during this debate. Raise your hand. Yeah, okay, I thought so. Awesome. Because these folks are, so now they're getting brave, now the hands are going up. Because I think what you've done is we've created another way for them to communicate, either to others within the room or outside, that you may not have otherwise. Because let's face it, you get home, I'm gonna call and explain. Well, that doesn't always happen, right? So we have now these abilities to communicate in different ways. It's the 21st century. We have to start embracing this. And if you don't know how to do it, you just find a 10-year-old to show you. Because that's what I did. And they can do it. So people are nervous that, well, it's going to take away the face-to-face or some of the personal interrelationships, or maybe it'll open up, we have to worry about firewalls at schools and all of this. Well, those issues existed even before Facebook or Zuckerman was even born. So I think it's kind of an exciting time. I'm going into it very cautiously, but carefully, but finding that it's creating new ways to communicate. Could you imagine the Ronald Reagan Facebook page? Could you just see him tweeting on there?
Oh, yeah.
I think he would just be embracing this like crazy.
He still does. If you watch our Facebook page, he
does?
Communicates. We have his quotes going out on a daily basis.
Well, and there's another huge initiative, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, if some of you are familiar with that, is all about embracing this and teaching not only the use of it, but the responsible use of it too, and it comes back to that. So yes, we want to open the doors and the floodgates, but we need to teach what they think of as digital citizenship as well. Using it appropriately, using it properly, using it with respect and intelligence. So, and I know the Reagan Center here has done a lot of great work with social media. They've got great programs going on. We had Sandra Day O'Connor here with how many kids were in the room, Tony?
About 800 or
800,
so, yeah.
And they were all tweeting. And you could just see the tweets coming down over Sandra Day O'Connor, and she's responding to it. So, it was very exciting and very engaging. So it's a little scary, but I think it's got great potential. I get a daily tweet or Facebook from my member of Congress. I think that's cool.
The first day of school each year at UCLA, I tell my students, if you have an open laptop or a cell phone on your lap, you'll be executed. And somebody, I think you asked me how many I executed, and I said 1. No, we didn't do any, but I think students, they're pretending they're doing something that relates to your class, but they're not. They're looking at Facebook, Twitter, or something else. I fortunately have a staff that helps me on different things, and they put things on Twitter and Facebook for me. But the thing to realize, if you're a public figure or you're running for office, there are people that make a living out of finding negative things about you. And what they do is, if you're on Facebook with a bunch of friends and then you're having one drink too many or something, your opponents are going to use that against you. So, it's a very tricky stuff. It also is very effective in starting riots in a lot of countries, as we've seen in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a lot of good in it, but you have to use it very intelligently.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Yeah, there was just a story on the news the other day about there's firms now that help high school seniors, which I know there are a number of you in the audience, clean up their Facebook page before they apply to colleges, because colleges are now actually looking at those Facebook pages, and in some cases, admissions decisions. So to your idea, one of the things I think we said is, it's a wonderful new frontier, but like any frontier, it needs to be treaded into with a wee bit of caution. Excellent.
Parents to friend their kids.
To see what's going on. Excellent. Well, so thank you very much. I just wanted to thank all three of you for coming and stepping back a little bit.
It was fun. Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Thank you.
So now you guys are going to make your decision and announce it. We're going to call up the other 6 students here in just a moment. Now, the judges have the kind of unenviable task of coming to their final decision on those 2. And in the meantime, while they're coming to their final decision on the debate that we heard, I did want to recognize our other 6 competitors, and I did want to give a chance for one of our sponsors to come up and talk a little bit about his program. So Rick Duffy is from the National Student Leadership Conference, and each of our 8 finalists who are here today, through the generosity of the National Student Leadership Conference, are going to be given a full tuition scholarship to participate in one of their summer leadership programs, which are fantastic. And so I wanted to give him just a moment to talk a little bit about those, and then when he's done, we're going to call our other 6 competitors who have been with us and have come in from all different parts of the country to the stage to receive their awards. So.
And I know what the finalists are thinking. My God, do we have to listen to somebody else talk now? It's been a great honor for me to be part of all this, and it's been a very inspirational day. And as I watch the debates today and see all the finalists and the quality of your arguments and the effort you put into it, it really is inspirational and gives us great hope for the future of this country. The National Student Leadership Conference, we're a by-invitation program, and I'm very pleased to be able to give scholarships to you finalists because you are exactly the type of people that we want to have in our conferences. This last summer, we had students from almost every state in the Union, plus 79 foreign countries. And we have programs that we do around the country, and you'll be free to come to any program that you want. And we've got a lot of the information in here, but we also tell you how to get to our website, and that will tell you all about the programs and the work that we do. And hopefully, we will make you in the summer a better leader. Should we call them up? Sure. Do you want to call them up, or do you want me to mispronounce their names?
Here, I'll call them up, and if you want to present them with their plaque, and then
okay, great.
Photos. So, and you have, or here, I'll give you these 2, and you can hand them back. Okay, so I want to call up our 6 other regional champions to be publicly recognized for the outstanding. So each of our regional champions has advanced through a field in their region. So the first person I would like to call up, let me make sure I get this. So the first 4 students that I'm going to call up are each champions of a region. They are each going to receive a $2,500 college scholarship to whatever college they end up going to. And they will also receive the full tuition scholarship to the National Student Leadership Conference. So the first person I would like to call up is from our Western Region champion, Nicholas Ontiveros, who is a junior at Granite Bay High School. Just to tell you a little bit about him, he's a straight-A student, captain of his school's speech and debate team, president of the DECA Club, and former treasurer of DECA. He also served as a summer intern for California Assembly member Richard Payne, and based on what I've seen of his work, he might be an Assembly member at some point himself, so congratulations to you. I mean, actually, do you want to kind of, we'll stay on stage, we'll get a group shot at the end. The next person I'd like to recognize is our Northeastern Region champion. Caroline Ring is a high school senior in Redding, Connecticut, and for the past 3 years, she's been a member of her school's debate and mock trial teams and the captain of the Fed Challenge team. Her team competes in the CDA, is it Dan Ice? Is that how you say it? Yeah, there we go. In the independent debate events, and her school team has actually been state champions for 4 of the past 5 years. So Caroline, congratulations. Okay. Next up was our champion of the Southern Region, who comes to us from Florida. Ryan Collins is a homeschool senior and a native Floridian. He's competed in the National Christian Forensic Communicators Association for 2 years and looks forward to using his debate skills in college and hopes to one day have a career in politics. So congratulations to you. The next person I'd like to recognize was the winner of our online region, who kind of an interesting trajectory for this particular contestant. She competed initially in the Western region, where she was runner-up, then decided she liked it so much, she took another week to learn a completely new topic and compete in our online region, which she won last Saturday, and in this week has learned a completely new topic to emerge and compete as a finalist. She is a high school freshman. Sarah Whipple started debate in middle school and earned second place in the country in her 8th grade year after spending 6 years in speech therapy to overcome a speech impediment. She's a member of the German and philosophy clubs, mathletes, and of course the speech and debate team. So congratulations to you, Sarah. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And you were a junior delegate, right, at the convention? Yeah. I forgot one more thing that I think would be of particular interest to this crowd. She was is it a youth delegate or a youth delegate at the Republican National Convention back in August. So. Next, I wanted to honor our semifinalists. So these 2 competitors have each earned a scholarship of $4,000, is in addition to the full tuition scholarship for the National Student Leadership Conference. So our first one is from the Mid-Atlantic region. Sarah Ann Evans is 17 years old, a homeschool junior from Fairfax, Virginia. She's been involved in the NCFCA Homeschool Speech and Debate League for a number of years and is an active member of Venture Scouts and her church youth group. So congratulations to you as well. And our other semifinalist was from the greater Texas region. And this young lady, I've actually had the most fun talking about her this week because her name is Kansas. She is from Louisiana, and she won the Texas region. which has been a lot of fun. So Kansas Guidry is a high school senior in New Orleans, Louisiana. With an A average, she's a member of the Student Council, National Honor Society, the Mu Alpha Theta Honor Society, and the swim team. She's also a student preacher, secretary of the Junior Classical League, debate captain, and participates in the Roman Catholic Church as an acolyte and a leader of the Catholic Youth Organization. And she's also a two-time state champion. So congratulations to you, Kansas. And I do just want to point out that you've heard all the activities these students are involved in, that this program was not a school program. This is a program that these students have entered into voluntarily, above and beyond all the other things that they're doing. So to see the results of what they've done, it really gives me a great deal of faith that civic education is something that doesn't necessarily have to be kind of legislated, but it's something that, with dedicated parents and schools and people who really care about it, is something that can happen on its own, organically, and produce the type of wonderful, informed, engaged citizens that we see. So congratulations once again to all of you. Yeah, you can go ahead, Richard. I think we're going to take a group picture afterwards, but now this is where the Jeopardy theme song plays, because our judges are backstage discussing. I'm sure Adam and Nancy are not happy with that, but if you'll just give us a few more moments, I'll go back and check, and we'll be back in just a moment to announce our national champion. Okay, do you want to come here? Okay, so I'd like to invite both Nancy and Adam to come back and join us on the stage. And so I'm informed that it's a split decision, and to reveal that decision, I yield the stage to Mayor Reardon.
Well, I'm supposed to keep you guessing for a minute, but I'll tell the two debaters the one thing that we thought they could have done better on, they were both the same, is talking about the end game. Like, how would a balanced budget help us get a better education? How would not having a balanced budget would help us get a better education, and why. But we had, as you saw, we were away for a long time. We couldn't make up our minds, so we had to make, at the end, to decide. And the winner is Adam. Okay. Great leaders of our country are usually one that loses one election and then becomes president the next time around. So Nancy, why don't you say how it feels?
I am just so grateful for this opportunity to come out here. This is actually my first time in California, and so obviously my first time at the Ronald Reagan Foundation, and it's been an incredible experience. I love meeting all of the different competitors from different districts and getting to learn about this topic, which is so interesting. So I just want to say thank you, and Adam did an excellent job, and I'm sure we'll see him in politics someday.
Okay, here. Let's put that up above your head. Adam, don't brag now.
I mean, I guess the first thing I'd like to say is no matter what happened today, this is awesome. Like, standing in front of a big crowd with the lights and the cameras and the presidential podium, this is awesome. But the other thing that I really would like to say is how appreciative I am of these organizations coming together to give me this opportunity to have a great education. You know, going into high school, I was one of those kids who really didn't see the point of learning. But I've had the benefit of an incredible staff of teachers at the Cleveland Humanities Magnet over in Reseda, which has shown me that there really is hope for education in this country. And it comes from truly inspiring teachers like the ones at my school, and also from fantastic programs and debate like the ones that we had here tonight.
Put that over your head. Good job. Okay, dinner served.
All right. That's it.
Can I invite our finalists to come back on stage so we can take a group picture with the judges, please?